The Jets are on their bye this weekend, but there are plenty of games that matter to them on the NFL schedule. What should Jets fans watch for in Week 10 of the NFL season? That's what we'll talk about today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, November 11th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button wherever you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. It is Friday, and normally on Friday, we have a game to preview. Our Friday shows typically are talking about that week's opponent for the Jets. There is no opponent this week. The Jets are on their bye week. Each team gets 1 week off during the NFL season. I tend to think in most cases you're better off having it late in the season because the hits have really piled up. Everybody's kind of playing a little banged up at this point of the season. So I think getting a November bye, the later the better, but a November bye typically is beneficial. Of course, there are always moments, there are always seasons where you have a lot of injuries early on, and sometimes it benefits you to have an early bye, but I think it's better for the Jets to have a late bye in most situations. You wonder how much they lose the momentum after the win against Buffalo, but something, I think a November bye probably suits the Jets pretty well. I do think in the future, the NFL is going to go to a format where each team gets 2 byes, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I think it's just a player safety thing. Again, football is a very physical sport. If you talk to guys who play, they say by the end of the season, nobody's really healthy. Everybody's playing through something. So to the extent you can help guys get a little bit fresher, maybe that's a good thing. But I think a bigger reason perhaps is when they added the 17th game to the season last year and made the season 18 weeks long, the regular season, they pushed the Super Bowl back 1 week before President's Day weekend. So it just seems logical to me that eventually they'll just add an extra weekend, and then the Super Bowl will be President's Day weekend every year. Super Bowl Sunday will be the Sunday of a long weekend. People won't have to work on Monday. That just seems very logical, but that's down the line. Although, it's funny because the NFL did have, in 1993, for 1 year, they put in a format where each team got 2 byes, and it was an 18-week season. Now, this is information that will never do you any good unless maybe you're on Jeopardy one day, and this is a final Jeopardy question. If that's the case, then you can thank me for it. But yeah, in that 1 year in 1993, there actually was an 18-week season. So last year, everybody said it's the first week 18 in NFL history. It really was not. In 93, there was a week 18. That was a rough year for the Jets, by the way. They went 8-8, started 8-5. They needed to win one of their last 3 games to make the playoffs. And they got blown out by Dallas on a Saturday afternoon in the Meadowlands, a pouring rainstorm. That was the second year of Dallas's back-to-back Super Bowl wins. They went up to Buffalo, lost an absolute heartbreaker to the Bills, a Bills team that went to the Super Bowl. The Jets should have won that game. Their kicker missed 3 field goals in that game. And then the final week of the season, they went to Houston, an Oilers team that had nothing to play for. It was a Sunday night game, and Buddy Ryan, it was a famous game because the Oilers defensive coordinator, Buddy Ryan, who's Rex Ryan's father, punched the offensive coordinator, Kevin Gilbride, on the sideline. What was lost in that is the Jets got blown out by a Houston team playing its backup quarterback and missed the playoffs. So I think at some point we're going to see 2 byes, but for now we only have 1 bye. So in some ways it's kind of frustrating because the Jets had that big win last week, and you want to keep the momentum going, but in some ways it's good because you get 2 weeks to enjoy that Buffalo win. And it's much different than most of us thought we'd be heading into this bye. I think most of us figured the Jets would have a rough time against Buffalo and would be spending 2 weeks being miserable, talking about how the Jets were falling apart. Well, they're not. They're 6-3 right now. And for the first time since 2015, we're at the midway point of November, and we can actually look at what the playoff situation looks like, and we actually have some rooting interest. Now, I guess you could say the Jets have had rooting interest in recent years because they've been so bad that, they've been rooting for bad teams to win to improve the Jets' draft position. But it's been a while. I think it's been since 2015, which was the last time we could actually root for opponent. We could actually root with the playoffs in mind. So on today's show, I want to talk about what's at stake week 10 of the season, which teams Jets fans should be rooting for, because it's going to be pretty relaxing Sunday of football. We don't have to worry about the Jets losing. On the other hand, when you're good, maybe you want to see your team out there. It's been a while since we've been good, but Jets fans certainly have rooting interest in these games on Sunday. Now, there are some games where they don't matter a whole lot. Some games where maybe it's a moderate rooting interest. In fact, that's what I'd say about the first game of these. Not the first game of the weekend, because Atlanta and Carolina played last night, but the first game of Sunday takes place in Germany. It's the Seattle Seahawks versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And you cannot predict the NFL. And I said this, the funny thing is I said this when the schedule came out, that you don't know who's going to be good, you don't know who's going to be bad. But of course, one of the things that I said was, an exception is, the Jets are going to play Seattle late in the season. We know they're going to be bad. Well, so much for that. The Seattle Seahawks actually look really good with Geno Smith. Who would have ever thought that? And they play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Game kicks off 9:30 Eastern Time. Game is being played in Germany. I think that this is a game where you may have a small rooting interest from this standpoint, is this is the time of year where sometimes surprising teams kind of hit a roadblock and it causes them to stumble the rest of the way. And that just creates issues for you. It could be the first negative moments that kind of just sends you in a tailspin. It's something the Jets need to watch out for after the bye, by the way. And Seattle, of course, been one of the great surprises of the NFL this year. Meanwhile, Tampa Bay really not playing very well. They are coming off a big win over the Rams last Sunday, a game that they probably should have lost. I think that, you maybe have moderate rooting interest, as much as I hate to say root for Tom Brady. I feel like you want Seattle, if it's possible, to go into that tailspin near the end of the season, because that building that they play in, it's a really tough spot for a visiting team, especially when the Seahawks are good. The way things are shaping up, that could actually be a big game for the Seattle Seahawks when the Jets meet them near the end of the regular season. So, if you could get the Seattle Seahawks playing poorly down the stretch, if you could get a situation where maybe things are not going so well for them, maybe, they hit a losing streak and maybe things fall apart a bit for them. I'm not sure I'm expecting that, but it would be nice. Again, that one's not the end of the world. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but I would like for Seattle to, kind of fall off a little bit. I don't want to be facing a Seattle team that looks great heading into that game the Jets will be playing with them later this season, because it could be a big game for the Jets, but it also could be, if Seattle keeps playing well, it could also be a big game for them. Again, I'm not expecting it, but I think, there's a moderate hope something like that could happen. The next game on the schedule is this is the 1:00 slate of games. You have two NFC North opponents. You have the Lions versus the Bears. Jets have both of these teams on their remaining schedule, so it's tough to say. I mean, the Jets get the Bears in a couple of weeks, so maybe you root against them. Maybe you root for them to fall apart because the Jets get the Bears before they get the Lions. I don't know that there's really that big of a rooting interest in this game for Jets fans, though. I think, unless you're obsessed with, like, Justin Fields, how he's doing versus Zach Wilson, maybe you care about it then, but that doesn't really impact anything about the New York Jets right now. So I don't know that that's really a game that matters all that much. Of course, there are some games that matter quite a bit for the Jets this weekend, namely the games involving their AFC East rivals. Now, the Patriots are on a bye, but the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins are in action, and we'll talk about those games as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode is sponsored by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business, and you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. You post your listing, then add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Again, that's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. We're talking Week 10 NFL action. There's no Jets game this weekend. There's also no New England Patriots game. The Patriots are actually on their bye, so Jets play at New England next weekend. Both teams are coming off their bye, so both teams have an extra week to prepare. So, normally you have a bit of an advantage coming off your bye. Jets don't really have that this weekend. Neither does New England. Although you may remember last year the Jets went to New England off their bye and played their worst game of the season. So you can never really tell on these things. But there are two AFC East teams in action. And these are important games because Jets find themselves right now half a game behind the Buffalo Bills with a tiebreaker in hand. And they find themselves tied with the Miami Dolphins with the tiebreaker in hand. So two really important games. Buffalo hosts Minnesota Sunday, 1 o'clock Eastern time is kickoff. That's an obvious game. You would love to see the Minnesota Vikings beat the Buffalo Bills because if that happens, the Jets are going to end the day technically in first place. There may be a tie, but the Jets hold the tiebreakers over the teams they're ahead of. So it would be a really big thing. And, it's one of those situations where a Minnesota victory could have a bit of a ripple effect. I talked about this a bit in the last segment. You want to start sowing doubt this time of year in teams. And you'd love to see the Buffalo Bills lose a second straight game. And then they're on a losing streak. And then the pressure starts to build. The Bills entered the season with a lot of pressure on them. They were pretty much the consensus Super Bowl favorites. And up till last weekend, they had a rough game against Miami, a tough venue. But up till last weekend, they were living up to the hype. This is a seasoned Buffalo team, so, I'm not expecting them to completely collapse. This is a team that's won the AFC East the last couple of years. They're a team that's made a number of fairly deep runs in the postseason. A couple of years ago, they were in the AFC Championship game. They should have been there last year as well. If they could get a stop in 13 seconds, they would have gone back a second straight year, but they still made the divisional round. They were even in the playoffs back in 2019. So this is an experienced team. I worry a little bit more about a team that's less experienced, how they respond to adversity, because this Bills team has, they've had some adversity over the last couple of years that they've fought through, but it's a different pressure when there are expectations to the degree that there are expectations on the Buffalo Bills this season. You don't know how they're going to respond, but more significantly, and this is, we talk about intangibles that could come out of these games. The tangible is the Jets are a half game behind Buffalo in the AFC. And these games become a lot easier when it's against an NFC opponent because, sometimes if a team you're chasing is playing an AFC opponent, you have to worry, well, all right, maybe they lose their game. But if it's an AFC opponent, does that AFC opponent gain on us in the wild card race? That's not something you have to consider against Minnesota. Minnesota's off to a good start this season. They're a really solid team. And this race could get really interesting down the stretch, and this could get pretty wild if Minnesota beats Buffalo. Because then, you in that situation, I feel like you have all four teams have a shot at winning the division, and the Jets. You can say what you want about the Jets. The Jets beat Buffalo head to head. Now they beat Miami head to head too, but there were some extenuating circumstances there. But Jets beat Buffalo head to head, and this becomes a very, very interesting divisional race down the stretch if Minnesota beats Buffalo and the Jets end up. The Jets, because of tiebreakers, could actually end Sunday in first place if that happens. Now, another game, this is more along the lines of what I was talking about. You got Miami hosting the Cleveland Browns. I think you root for Cleveland in this game. Despite what I said, about, does this help Cleveland in the wild card chase? Miami's right there with the Jets. Miami's a more immediate threat in both the division and in the wild card race because right now the Jets are the 5 seed, which is the top non-division winner. The Dolphins are the 6. So you want to knock Miami down a little bit. The other thing is that the Jets have a win over Cleveland in their back pocket. So even if you were worried about that, the Jets are still ahead of Cleveland in the AFC playoff race. But if you were worried about that, you also have to remember the Jets do have that win over Cleveland in their back pocket. Now you may say, well, don't the Jets also have a head-to-head win over Miami? Yes, they do. But they also have a game at Miami. So, that tiebreaker could become a little bit messier if the Jets go down to Miami and lose later on in the season. So, I think clearly you want Cleveland to win that game. I think the dream weekend right now, to be honest with you, like all these other games, you may have a slight rooting interest, but these are the two games because if the Jets can get tied with Buffalo and then Miami loses this weekend, maybe the Jets end up a little bit clear of Miami. That's a great weekend for the New York Jets. And, it goes without saying, I guess it's obvious. You probably did not need to listen to this podcast to know that it would be good for the Jets to have their two division rivals lose, but that's pretty much the case. And it's more significant than it normally is because we've been living in a world not just like the Jets being bad, but we've been living in a world where for the better part of 2 decades, up till like 2 years ago, every single year, most of the time you kind of conceded the division race, and I hated the mindset, but I think it was true for the Jets organization. I think it was true of the Jets fan base that before the start of the season, you kind of conceded the division race to New England. You kind of just assumed the Patriots would win the division. Even in years where the Jets got off to a hot start, people would say, well, it's not going to last. New England's the better team because they have Brady, because they have Belichick. That's not the case this year. This is the first time in a while it feels like the Jets have a legitimate puncher's chance at winning the division. Not saying it'll happen. I think the Jets are clearly underdogs to Buffalo. You could even argue maybe they're underdogs to Miami right now. But there's a pathway for the Jets to win this division, and these games could certainly help. Now, of course, the Jets are going to need to take care of their own business once they get back from the bye. None of this matters unless the Jets win. And on some level, I don't love the idea that you're spending a whole weekend rooting against the opposition because really what you do is more significant. But with no Jets game this weekend, all you can do is look at what the other teams in your division are doing, what your competitors are doing. And certainly Minnesota over Buffalo would be a big win for the Jets, and so would Cleveland over Miami. Now, as we close out this Friday episode of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about a couple other games. Obviously, the big 2 games are in the division, but there are a couple other games worth watching, keeping your attention on. Well, that's what we'll discuss as we close out this Friday podcast episode. This episode is brought to you by SimpliSafe. If you've thought about securing your home with home security, but have been putting it off, you'll want to listen up. Right now, Locked On Jets listeners can order the #1 rated SimpliSafe home security system for 50% off. This is their biggest offer of the year, and you don't want to miss it. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents use the Fast Protect technology exclusively from SimpliSafe to capture critical evidence and verify the threat is real, so you can get priority police requests. SimpliSafe was named the best home security system of 2022 by U.S. News & World Report for a 3rd year in a row. And SimpliSafe is a whole home security system with advanced sensors for every room, window, and door, HD security cameras from inside and out, smarter ways to detect motion that alert you only when a threat is real, and even hazard sensors that detect fires, floods, and other threats to your home. And they have 24/7 professional monitoring services that cost less than $1 a day, less than half the price of ADT's traditional professionally installed system. Don't miss your chance to save big. Get 50% off the new SimpliSafe system at simplisafe.com/lockedonnfl today. This is their biggest discount of the season, so don't wait. That's simplisafe.com/lockedonnfl. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about Week 10 of the NFL season. No Jets game, but plenty of games worth watching for the Jets. Really, the 2 big games are in the division. There are some other games that maybe could draw your attention. Jacksonville, Kansas City is kind of an interesting game because this creates kind of the dynamics I was talking about in the last segment. The Jets, if they win the division, suddenly what the Chiefs are doing is really important because you're talking about playing for playoff seeding. On the other hand, the Jets do have Jacksonville later in the season. And do you want Jacksonville to kind of get on a little bit of a roll? Coming off a win, Trevor Lawrence seems like he's starting to figure things out. Jacksonville, could they be kind of a quiet team rising the ranks of the AFC if they get a big win over Kansas City? I still lean toward rooting for Jacksonville, though, because right now, and it's crazy to say, but right now, I think at this point in time, you'd have to say the division is a bigger concern for the Jets than teams that are behind them in the wild card race. And I know the Chiefs are not in the same division, but Jets have a shot to win the division. And if the Jets do win the division, then suddenly what the other division winners do, Kansas City, what that team does, really makes a big difference going forward. So to me, I think you root for Jacksonville in that game. You kind of hope Jacksonville's not on a roll when they come in here, right before Christmas on a Thursday night. But I think right now my priority is focused on seeding because the Jets are on the top half of this conference, so you can't worry about what's going on in the bottom half. I think we've been so conditioned to just focus on the wild card, focus on teams behind you that we forget the Jets can advance now. And I maybe wouldn't be saying that if they had lost to Buffalo last weekend, but that really changed everything. The other game worth watching in the AFC is Denver versus Tennessee. And I go back to what I just said. Denver is a team that's kind of on the fringes of the wild card race, but the Jets have a head-to-head win over them. So I don't think they're that big of a threat. And based on what we've seen this year, I just don't envision Denver going on that big of a run, whereas Tennessee, they're probably going to win the AFC South. So again, focusing on the division, I think you got to pull for Denver in that game because Tennessee could be a team the Jets are playing against for seeding, in an ideal world where they do win the AFC East. So you have a couple other games that are on the schedule. I don't think Houston versus the Giants really matters all that much. I don't think the Saints versus the Steelers matters. Although I guess Pittsburgh, I don't know. I guess Pittsburgh conceivably could rip off a bunch of wins and get themselves back into the race. I don't really see that happening, but I guess since they're playing an NFC opponent, it doesn't really matter. And an NFC opponent that's not really on the Jets schedule, that game, it really doesn't make that big of a difference. You've got the Colts versus the Raiders. Both those teams seem like they're out of the race. That's a game where, even though it's AFC, even though I just don't think either of those teams really has much of a winning streak in them. So that's not really a game of much significance. You got Cardinals, Rams, two NFC teams, neither on the schedule. I don't think that matters. Same for Cowboys, Packers. I guess since Green Bay's on the schedule, if you get low enough, I think there is a strength of schedule tiebreaker. So maybe you root for Green Bay, but that game doesn't really matter. Really, the only game that has any degree of significance is the Chargers 49ers. The Chargers being an AFC team, I think obviously you'd root for the 49ers to win. I think that's kind of clear because the Chargers are a team that's in the mix in the AFC. Inconsistent as always, as has been the case with the Chargers forever. It doesn't matter who's with the Chargers, doesn't matter who's coaching, doesn't matter who's playing for them. The Chargers are always an inconsistent team that you can never trust. But they are a competitor with the Jets in the AFC, so that's a game where I think it matters. And then you got the Monday night game of the Commanders versus the Eagles. Who cares about that? So, really the focus is on the division this week. I think everything else is really only kind of tangential. I mentioned the two NFC games early on where Seattle, maybe you get them playing and get them into a little bit of a slump. Lions, Bears, maybe you get the Bears playing poorly before they go into MetLife Stadium in a few weeks. But really the focus is on Miami versus Buffalo. And then, so I think those are really the games that matter for the Jets this weekend. And, you hope by the end of the weekend, maybe the Jets will be leading the division. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Help the channel out, help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy the games. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.